So we've mentioned the Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church. Now we can talk about the Reformed churches, kind of a third establishment denomination within Protestantism. Now remember, we're talking about these as kind of separate movements, separate denominations. Originally, there certainly was hope among many of these leaders that they could all come together and in some sense have one kind of Protestant church, even if that terminology wasn't quite being used yet, but one church to rival the Roman Catholic Church. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time of the English Reformation, whom we just discussed, he actually was throughout his life sending letters to people in Germany, to people in Switzerland, trying to get some sort of council where everybody would come together in order to unify as that rival church or movement against the Roman Catholic Church. He was never really successful in getting that general council of Protestants to come together to hopefully get on the same page theologically. And remember, with Luther's understanding of the sources of authority, there's a lot more room for a difference of interpretation because there isn't simply one group of individuals, right, a hierarchical leadership within a church that is able to determine everything for everyone. Now, you could have Luther disagree with Thomas Cranmer, and here we're going to introduce John Calvin. And when you start to see the disagreements, they're all based on their own understandings of Scripture, and therefore there's not an easy way to mediate between those differences. And that's why there never really was able to be one Protestant church. Instead, there were Protestant churches. Even in the 16th century, we see that fragmentation occur. So John Calvin eventually flees France and finds himself in Switzerland, and he ends up becoming kind of the leader of the Reformed tradition that is kind of making its way through a variety of towns and cities, especially in and around Switzerland. He ends up really settling in Geneva, which becomes a center point for the Reformation and Reformation theology. I always think in some ways Martin Luther can be more fun to read because he's a little bit all over the place and he's got his hot temper and he's super passionate about everything. Calvin is always thought of more as the systematic theologian of the Reformation. Sometimes a little bit drier, I think, for a lot of people, but perhaps a little bit more systematic, perhaps a little bit more careful in terms of the theology that he is putting forth. Not to say that Luther doesn't have a lot of consistency in his message, but Calvin definitely is more systematic in the way he puts forth what he believes is Reformation theology. And the churches that kind of form around him as an important leader and around some of his successors as important leaders are often referred to as the Reformed churches. Now, eventually we will get specific denominations flowing out of this Reformed movement. For example, Presbyterianism, which really becomes important in some of Great Britain and then eventually over to America, has a very direct historical tie to the Reformed movement that really took shape under the leadership of John Calvin. Calvinist theology is often studied, and we often think about the central features of Calvinist theology by using the acronym TULIP. And each letter of TULIP signifies something very important to John Calvin's theology. We're not going to go into the details of TULIP at this point, but I do want to mention one interesting doctrine that really becomes central to a lot of what John Calvin is doing, and certainly became maybe not as central, but important for many of the Reformation key figures, like Thomas Cranmer in England, for example, and many, many others. And this is the doctrine of predestination. It certainly isn't a new doctrine put forth by John Calvin or Thomas Cranmer or any other reformer. It had existed for a long time. There are passages, especially from Paul in the Bible, that use the language of predestination or preordination or a variety of other terms that often are translated to those words. Augustine, not surprisingly, is one of the most important early theologians to tackle this issue. And Augustine very strongly defended the notion of predestination. And what this meant for Augustine is that every human being born after Adam and Eve, with the exception of Jesus, as we have seen, is already guilty of sinfulness, guilty of original sin, even if not yet actual sin. And what this meant for Augustine is that we are all in what he called the lump of perdition. We all deserve to be judged and damned as a result of our sinfulness and our disobedience to God. And yet, for Augustine, God, in his grace and mercy, from all eternity, determined that there would be a few people that would be able to escape that lump of perdition. Right? And God had determined those people from all eternity in his mind and in his will. What this means is that the question of whether or not I am going to be one of those lucky ones to escape the lump of perdition and be saved is not a decision that I make, first and foremost. First and foremost, it is a decision that God has made from all eternity. In that sense, if I am lucky to escape, I have been predestined by God's eternal will. I have been destined for salvation before I even existed in these last few decades, because it is a matter of God's eternal election. Now, for Augustine, God didn't choose people to be damned and to go to hell. They determined that on their own by being sinners. So this is what we might call single predestination. Predestination is a completely positive doctrine or concept for Augustine, because when you're talking about predestination, it only refers to those whom God has allowed to escape the lump of perdition. And the idea is that if you are one of the elect, then God will give you the grace that is needed to accept the message of the gospel and to actually experience that kind of salvation while you are living on this earth. Augustine even says that you are given an irresistible grace, which means that it's a grace that can't really be resisted. Again, this does seem to remove yourself out of the equation at least a little bit, because it's not really you making the decision completely independently. You have been given the grace that is already going to necessarily lead you to work with God and to accept God's grace to become saved. Now, Calvin, when he shows up, is going to be remembered for teaching double predestination. For Calvin, God has eternally determined the destiny of every single human being. He has willed the salvation of some and the damnation of others. God has actively determined that from all eternity in his mind and in his will. And some people say, well, maybe all Calvin means, and maybe all Augustine meant, is that God simply knows in advance which people will accept him and which people will reject him. Calvin was very clear, a little bit clearer, I think, than Augustine, that predestination should not be confused with divine foreknowledge. Yes, God knows everything that has ever occurred, will ever occur, etc. But predestination for Calvin is not just God knowing things, it is God willing things. God has willed from all eternity those who will be saved and those who will be damned. This is a tricky doctrine. In some ways, it flies in the face of free will and the human freedom to choose salvation or not. And again, whenever we come up against these tricky doctrines, I think it's important to step back and say, well, why? Why was this doctrine seen as so important? And once again, the answer is going to be because it ensures something important about the message of salvation. Think about Calvin, think about Thomas Cranmer and other reformers. What are they trying to do? Well, primarily they're trying to say that we are not saved by anything that we do. That was the concern that Luther had about the Roman Catholic Church at that time, that it was too focused on active righteousness. So what is one way that you can make sure that humans will recognize that nothing that they do saves them, that it's all a matter of God's grace specifically through Christ? Well, one way you can do that is to say that the decision about salvation has actually already been made and has been made from all eternity. If that's the case, then clearly I should recognize that nothing that I'm doing actually impacts whether or not I will be saved, because it has already been determined. I simply have to accept by faith the grace that has been provided to me as one of the elect, right? So this is one of these really interesting doctrines, often thought of in connection with John Calvin as a 16th century reformer, but was very important maybe to a lesser degree, to many other Reformation thinkers. Not all, but many other Reformation thinkers. There will eventually be a pushback against some of these Calvinist doctrines by others within the Reformed tradition. And we'll have a little bit of a theological battle between these two groups. But Calvinist theology remains alive and well to this day, even in its idea of double predestination, even though we don't necessarily hear too much about it during church sermons, for example, because it is a tricky doctrine. It seems in some ways arbitrary, unfair, but for Calvin, some of that was sort of the point, because it made sure that the decision about salvation was purely a decision for God alone. And it's not something that we do on our own, through our own effort or our own actions.